Kamala Harris over the weekend, in speaking to supporters, appeared to call former President Donald Trump a coward. Headline reads, 2024 Showdown. Harris appears to call Trump a coward in a campaign trail appearance at foxnews.com. Vice President Harris on Saturday labeled former President Trump a coward, speaking to a crowd of staff, volunteers, and supporters at a campaign field office in Beaver County just outside of Pittsburgh. Quote, this campaign is about a recognition that, frankly, over the last several years, there's been this kind of perversion that has taken place, I think, which is to suggest that the measure of the strength of a leader is based on who you beat down, when what we know is that the real true measure of the strength of a leader is based on who you lift up, said Kamala Harris. It's an interesting rhetorical flourish, and one not without some sentimental or philosophical kernel of truth. Strength is not just beating someone down. Strength is not insults. Strength is who you inspire. Strength is who you lift up. But strength and cowardice are most obviously defined by the choices one makes. Action, not words. Are you lifting up or are you beating down? With how you run for president. One could easily argue that marks of strength would be taking on hostile interview after hostile interview, taking on adversarial question after adversarial question, giving press conferences, interviews, welcoming debates, no matter the time, no matter the place, no matter the venue. One could argue that a mark of strength is surviving an attempted assassination, shot through the ear, standing up immediately, and imploring your crowd to, quote, fight, fight, fight. One could argue those are pretty obvious traits of strength. And I think one could easily similarly argue that going on 30 days of a campaign without granting a friendly interview, without taking on much more than a few questions in a press gaggle, with never giving an open press conference, trying to control the outlets, the time, the place, and the moderators of a debate, running a candidacy on vibes and the protection of a media partnership that is ensuring a positive image would be marks of cowardice. Would be how Kamala Harris is running for president. The only real bold measure from Kamala Harris in her candidacy so far, 1 month in, are the scant economic proposals she gave us last week. Kamala Harris gave one particular proposal that, at a minimum, we can call bold. Last week, Harris, in response to inflation caused under this administration's Inflation Reduction Act, stimulus spending bills, promised to take on inflation day one. And how? Through price controls. She promised to go after grocers, price gouging, that industry making 1.5% margins in profit. The average private industry making somewhere around 8% margin in profit. Grocers making 1.5%, according to Kamala Harris, are price gouging. So she promises to put in controls to ensure that none of these greedy grocery corporations or food manufacturers are getting more than their 1.5%. This is a well-worn historical path. We know, almost like dominoes, how one domino knocks down the next. You start with running a government deficit, spending, putting more money into the economy than goods and services are capable of soaking up, printing money. This in turn causes inflation. Inflation rising at one point during the Biden-Harris administration to 9%. Again, this is a well-worn historical path that we've seen from Latin American country to Latin American country. When inflation spikes, then central banks have to do something to try to mop up that money. How do they do that? They raise interest rates. We've seen interest rates here in the United States go 7%, 8%. When interest rates go up, it makes it harder for the borrower to buy a home, to take on credit card debt. So people rack up more debt because they're paying more in interest. And like the public sector, like the government, the private citizen also now starts to live in a deficit with debt. They're hurting. The economy has become their major concern. And despite the fact that you could point to markers like an unemployment rate that suggest, oh, no, we're doing fine in the economy, you get this sense of insecurity. And you can see why there'd be this insecurity or why people would say, yeah, my number one issue is the economy. I don't feel good about the economy. It's not because the media keeps telling you the economy is bad, because people know how they legitimately feel, and they feel insecure as prices rise and they mount up debt. In steps the government. We're going to institute price controls. We're going to make sure that you don't keep paying more for eggs. And what happens after price controls? After the domino, we know the next domino. Food shortages, bread lines, gas lines. It's happened over and over. And it's been explained by true economic geniuses as to why this command and control economy is a certain historical failure. Here is economist Milton Friedman.
It is a device that governments have repeatedly resorted to try to cover up the effects of their own policies. It is offered as a cure for inflation. It is not a cure for inflation. It has never been a cure for inflation. It is an alleged cure that is far worse than the disease, because its effect is to repress the symptoms, to repress the consequences of the more basic force.
And this is exactly what's happened here, not just across the globe, but at home in the United States. In the 1970s, the Nixon administration put in a general freeze on wages and the price of goods. No one for 90 days was allowed to raise the price of any particular good or wage. And it did, for a moment, repress inflation. But what happened is the minute these price controls are lifted, you get an explosion of inflation because, as explained by Friedman, you have simply repressed the natural inclination of a market. There's no single genius. This is always the failure. This is the ignorance. It's the kind of ignorance that comes only along with hubris. You think you're a genius, but you're actually a buffoon if you think that you are smart enough to understand the millions of choices made every day by consumers. Every little choice, every time you go to the store, every time you buy something, it's a vote. I like this product, I don't like that product. I like this price, I don't like that price. Every single choice you make throughout your day is a vote. Capitalism isn't perfect. It makes mistakes. There are bubbles. There's greed. There's fraud. There's such thing as a market correction. We get recessions in capitalism because we can have manias. We can have consumers over-index irrationally at time in one particular market. It's not perfect, capitalism, but it's smarter than any one individual or any Politburo of proposed geniuses who will tell you the price of bacon in Santa Fe, New Mexico. No one has the capability of enough inputs to understand the right choice in place of millions of choices. So that happened in the United States in the 1970s. On Friday night, I guest hosted Jesse Watters Primetime. We shared a fascinating example of what's happened to Venezuela. Did you know in the 1970s into the 1980s, Venezuela was the fourth largest economy in the world, oil rich, bigger than Canada, bigger than most of the countries in Europe. People in Venezuela lived good lives. They drove nice cars, they owned nice homes, they went to the zoo, they went to the movies. In the 1990s, through a populist message, comes the rise of socialist Hugo Chavez. Chavez instituted all of the same controls we are talking about here today with Kamala Harris and more. But he put in price controls, command and control economy. Today, Venezuela is the 156th biggest country in terms of GDP, from 4th to 156th, to bigger than European countries, to just above Uzbekistan. Those zoos that people used to visit, now people raid and kill the animals for food in Venezuela. And of course, the most famous example of this is the Soviet Union. Bread lines in the Soviet Union, toilet paper lines in Venezuela, gas lines in America in the 1970s. We know how these dominoes fall. And so it's so ridiculous, so bold, so lacking in humility So ignorant that even the likes of the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN have all criticized from the editorial board, in many of those instances like the Washington Post, this proposal from Kamala Harris. All of a sudden, it looks like she can't get away with verbal tics and the repetition of words that make her sound like she's giving a book report on a book she has not read. Here she is explaining her embrace now of the child tax credit.
The return on that investment in terms of what that will do and what it will pay for will be tremendous. We've seen it when we did it in the first year of our administration. We reduced child poverty by over 50%. So that's a lot of the work. And then what we're doing in terms of the tax credits, we know that there's a great return on that investment. When we increase home ownership in America, what that means in terms of increasing the tax base, not to mention property tax base, what that does to fund schools, again, return on investment. I think it's a mistake for any person who talks about public policy to not critically evaluate how you measure the return on investment.
Somebody taught Kamala return on investment. You're not just going to get away with that all of a sudden because it's a reminder of who Kamala Harris is. She was the furthest left voting senator in the United States Senate. And she was somebody a month ago that nobody thought was ready for prime time. Now she steps out in the smallest of stages and offers one policy proposal. And you're reminded she's not ready and she's far left. And that's where you arrive at cowardice, knowing that your candidate is incapable of a serious discussion of how to solve America's problems. She will now retreat to protection. She will now retreat to the Democratic National Convention. She'll now retreat to vibes. And I would imagine that would be a stronger definition of cowardice.